getting stuff set up here and so forth. There was an exam just before this class, so we didn't have the opportunity to get in ahead of time. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's lunchtime talk in Science and Math, Dr. David Lee, he's a Professor Emeritus from Florida International University and now a current resident of Crestone. So with that, please help me welcome the speaker.
So I'm one of many retired academics living in Crestone, and not that far from here. So we come to Alamosa. Is my sound all right? No, that's not going to make any difference. It doesn't go into the speaker. Okay. Oh, that's just recording then. Yep. Okay. You can hear me okay? Yes. Great. So this is the topic of today's talk. It's timely, although a little bit late. Autumn is pretty much past us, although it's definitely in evidence on your campus. Lots of yellows. I'm going to talk about autumn color as a general phenomenon, and then I'm going to home in with some pictures of autumn in the San Luis Valley and southwestern Colorado. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got interested in color, which actually has its origins in the tropics. And I'll talk about the color palette, how plants, the chemistry of plants producing color, and also the optics of that in leaves. And then I'll talk about color production in leaf senescence, and also the evolutionary significance of autumn color in plants, in temperate plants. So you've all seen many photographs of autumn in the east, and in the northeastern United States, this foliage period is worth billions of dollars of tourist revenue, and people come from all over the world to see it. And the buses of some of the state highways are just lined, the roads are just lined with buses. So this is in western Massachusetts. The little insert there shows you the plants that make up that assemblage of colors. The main players here in the background are sugar maple and red maple, and also beech for the yellows. And you go further south into the Appalachians, you get slightly different contributors to the color, but just as spectacular, perhaps even more spectacular than the Northeast, where you've got an oak there, a pin oak, and then you've got sourwood that are important in that photograph there. So that's what we think of when we think of, that's the sort of archetypal autumn color in the east. You do have autumn color in other forests throughout the world. It depends upon the species that are present in the forest. This is actually in southern Chile, and the color there is due to a single species of southern beech. So the color production then depends very much on the species that make up the forest, and whether they turn yellow or they turn red. Here we have autumn in southern Colorado, and that's of course the train from Antonito. You get the yellows of the aspens there. You get a little bit of red of the aspens in the foreground. It's a beautiful scene. That's a great train ride. And this is another view of that color from aspens. There's a detail of that aspen leaf in the Baca just south of Crestone, up on the Spanish Creek greenbelt. And this is another view of those aspens turning in near Mount Ouray at the northern end of the San Luis Valley. And just this last week, I went with some friends, my wife and some friends, to southwestern Colorado. My sense of autumn in Colorado, and I'm sort of new to this, is that it's every bit as spectacular as autumn in the Northeast. And the reason is because there's a lot of geographical variation in the display of color. And so here, taking 551 towards Silverton, up on this ridge here, you have the reds of the oaks, the scrub oaks, which are found over much of Colorado in areas that are not fully forested. And here is the same thing up in the north end of the San Luis Valley near Valley View Hot Springs. And the reds, the lower elevations there with a little bit of aspen and cottonwood in the riparian zones is due to the change in color of this oak. And you see this also at the Black Canyon of the Gunnison. Above the canyon, the oaks were turning beautifully when we were there last week. And I think the oaks turn color after the aspens turn color, generally. And also in the alpine of Colorado, you've got a number of plants, low alpine plants and subalpine plants, that turn red during senescence, leaf senescence before winter. You also have some plants that turn yellow, such as the alpine willow you see in the lower left inset. And so those make this sort of composite of yellows and reds, dull reds, in the Arctic landscape. Locally, you may have flushes of red color in valleys from the wild roses, both the fruits and occasionally the leaf changes varies from yellow to red, but in this case it's red. And that's in Carnero Creek on the west side of the valley. And of course, yellows in the riparian zones from the narrow leaf cottonwood. This is also in Carnero Creek. And just east of Wolf Creek Pass, not that far from here, it's a very wet area. It's like, it must be one of the, of course it's wet, we know because of the snow on the pass and the skiing, but the slope, the west-facing slope is pretty moist. And you get a feeling in the autumn foliage, it's almost like an eastern forest. And you've got dogwood there, you've got service bear, you've got a maple. And these turn varying colors of yellow and red. So it's a really spectacular place. That's a detail of that. So it gives you a sense of the diversity of autumn color in Colorado. And as I said before, I think it's just as spectacular as autumn in the east. This is a view of the southern end of the Wet Valley, just east of Blanca Peak. And you've got a variety of things going on there: oaks, aspens, cottonwoods, and you also have a lot of skunk brush, which you see producing the color here in this Carnero Creek Canyon. And it's very common in the valley on the lower elevations up into the mountains. And it turns a brilliant red. So there's a lot going on in Colorado. So let me explain how I got started in this. I worked at the University of Malaya from 1973 to 1976. And these are my friends that took me out in the forest. I knew very little about it when I went there. And they taught me about plants. Peter Ashton on the left taught me about forest ecology. Benjamin Stone in the middle taught me about the systematics of plants. And Brian Lowry on the right taught me a lot about the chemistry of these plants and the pigments in the plants. And then on our outings, we had Brian's dog Pooch, which we later inherited. It became our dog. So that led me to, when I was in Malaysia and for a long time afterwards, coming back to the United States, to study the phenomenon of leaf flush in tropical trees. In a tropical forest, the greatest display of colors occurs when the young leaves expand rapidly and often are brilliant colors. Pinks, reds, sometimes even purples, sometimes white. And so when you see a forest lit up from the distance, you see a crown of a tree, you think it's in flower, but it's just producing new leaves. And I got very curious about that, and I did research on it. And secondly, I got interested in these iridescent blue plants in the understory, where the color is actually produced structurally and not by the production of pigments. And so that interest in leaf color then led to eventually to research in the Northeast in the United States later on when we came back to the United States. So now let's talk a little bit about color. We're dealing now with subtractive color. because we're looking at a surface that has just whole light impinging on it, and the pigments are absorbing certain wavelengths from that source of light, subtracting it, and the result is a production of color. So you know from playing around with crayons when you were kids that if you take a red and a yellow crayon, you put them together, you get an orange. What's not so intuitive in all of this, however, is if you take a green and a red, green's not a primary color, but if you take green and a red and mix them together, you get brown. So remember when you're in the second grade and you did this, you said, what is that? It was like totally baffling. So you do get brown. And that's, the reason for that has to do with the pigments absorbing in wavelengths in such a way that what's left over and is reflected back out at you on the paper is subtracted from those, and it's what's left over, and that's the color you see. So a leaf is a little bit like a piece of paper. Actually, if you think of this leaf here, it consists, 80% of its mass consists of fibers of cellulose, which is what paper is made up of. But the structure is a little bit more complicated so that light can penetrate into the leaf and can be scattered by air spaces in the surface like you see in the image on the upper left. So those spaces strongly reflect light, and they can reflect it back out the surface or through the leaf. And so if the ray of light moves into the leaf and is scattered in such a way that it doesn't encounter any pigment, the result will be basically whole light. And the leaf, if it doesn't have any pigments in it, like this snow brush on the lower left here, will be essentially white because nothing is really subtracted. On the other hand, if that ray of light, if we imagine it in such a way, encounters molecules of chlorophyll, a green pigment, in those bodies, the chloroplasts in the interior of the leaf, the chloroplast absorbances, which are green and or blue and red, are subtracted, and you end up with green color. So this is the plant color palette that we need to understand about autumn foliage. The red colors are due to the production of a pigment known as anthocyanin, which is produced within the cytoplasm of the cells. And the colors of anthocyanins, there are several, and there are lots of them when you consider the attachment of sugars to the molecule, is either it's from a sort of an orange-red to a slightly purple, but basically red. And the pigment that's produced in leaves is entirely red, and it's the same molecule as that, cyanidin 3-glucoside. The second class of pigments are the carotenoids or xanthophylls that produce yellows. These are insoluble in water, and they're produced in plastids, and they're present on membrane surfaces. And then the chlorophylls at the bottom, which are green, which are produced in the plastids and chloroplasts and are the predominant color of plants. And it's the most ubiquitous, most abundant pigment molecule on the planet. So here's the chlorophylls in a nutshell. They're in plastids, shown in those little green bodies in the leaf transverse section. These are the actual chloroplasts in detail in the cell. And they absorb strongly in the reds and the blues. They do not absorb strongly in the greens here. And so when light hits chlorophyll, the blues and the reds are absorbed. The greens are not. They're scattered in the leaf so that if you hold the leaf up to the light, it passes through it. It looks green. If you look at the surface, it also looks green. The yellow pigment, such as in this marigold flower here, the carotenoids generally absorb strongly in the blue wavelengths, up a little bit into the greens. And so they do not absorb strongly in the yellows. And the predominant color of xanthophyls or carotenoids are yellows, Although in the case of tomatoes, the red of the tomato is a xanthophyll that absorbs more strongly and longer in the visible and produces red colors. So these little dots here are the plastids where these pigments are produced and stored. You also have a little bit of anthocyanin that's been produced here, which I'll talk about next. So the third of the color palette are the anthocyanins, which are red through violet. They absorb strongly in the green. That shifts in different types of anthocyanins a little bit. So the wild rose, like we have in the valley here, actually is the same. The anthocyanin pigment in the wild rose, in the petals, is also produced in the leaves during senescence, when the leaves are getting ready to fall off, so the leaves may turn red from the same pigment. Here's an example of a tropical plant, Codeum variegatum from Southeast Asia, and it just shows you how you have different combinations of pigments in the different parts of a leaf. So if you have just green here on the left, you get a green color. But if you have green and red, so you have a layer of anthocyanins and you have the chlorophyll inside, then you get a brown or almost a black color. If you have primarily just yellow from the carotenoids that are in this layer here, you get a yellow color. And if you have predominantly the anthocyanins right up here, you get a pink or a red color. All this can occur in these plants in the same leaf. So now here's what happens now when a leaf undergoes its senescence process during the fall, changes color and falls off the plant. This is a healthy leaf, and you see here the basic structure of the cells, the palisade cells in the leaf. In the center of the leaf, you have a very large vacuole. In the cytoplasm of a leaf, you have numerous chloroplasts, and they are loaded with the chlorophyll pigment. And then around the outside, you have cell wall, and then you have these air spaces that scatter light. So now you begin during senescence of a leaf that's going to turn red. You have the beginning of the production of anthocyanin. The anthocyanin is produced in the cytoplasm, and then it's moved into the vacuole of the cell. So the anthocyanins concentrate in the vacuole here. And then when the leaf is fully red, the anthocyanins are present in the vacuole at high concentration. Chlorophyll has been removed from the plastids, and you have a little bit of residual carotenoids that are present in these plastids. But the result is either, depending upon the concentration of the anthocyanins, either a strong red or an orange red before the leaf falls off. So that's what happens in the case of leaves that senesce red. So here, that would be the example of that would be the gamble oak, and some very small percentage of aspen do this. And an example I give here is the red oak, in which the absorbance by the red pigment then produces a red color. And that's where the anthocyanins are located. So now in yellow leaves, what happens is that the chloroplasts lose their chlorophyll. It's broken down. And also the protein components of the plastids are also lost. So what you end up with are these broken up bodies that have residual amounts of carotenoids in them, and that produces the yellow color. So an example of that is witch hazel. And these are those plastids that have lost all their chlorophyll scattered around with still yellow from the xanthophylls present, and that produces that yellow color. So the question now is, so we've seen that there are lots of examples around here where you have leaves, the plants in the fall, that as the leaves begin to senesce, get ready to lose their structure and function and fall off the plant. There are examples of leaves that turn yellow, like most of the aspens, like the cottonwood. And then there are leaves that turn red, like the gamble oak, like the skunk brush that we saw. Those are good examples of that. So the question that has been raised in the last 15 years or so is, what's the function, what's the possible evolutionary advantage of this color change? And it's particularly interesting for the production of red color, because in the case of red color, as the leaf is preparing to die essentially and fall off the plant, it is expending metabolic energy to produce pigments at the end of the lifespan of the leaf. Those pigments were not present during the normal function during the summer for the leaf. They're produced at the end of the lifespan. So there's been in the last 15 years or so some interest, and there's two hypotheses that have been raised. Physiologically, a hypothesis has been raised that the anthocyanins are photoprotective, function as a light screen. They also have antioxidant activity, and that could protect the senescence process to increase the amount of nitrogen that's located back into the plant. Now, the important thing about these functional hypotheses is that they have to basically explain an advantage to the plant the following year, not to the leaves as they're ready to fall off the plant. There's no possible advantage there. Now, secondly, hypotheses have been raised to basically that color is a signal that advertises toxicity or low nutritive quality to reduce herbivory and egg-laying that reduces herbivory in the following year. And then also, some people have argued that the color may be a signal to attract dispersal agents such as birds, pick up the fruits, move them out. They can see them more easily, and move them out and better disperse the seeds. So those are the two classes of hypotheses that have been raised, that we'll talk about now a little bit. So how do anthocyanins protect the leaves? We have good evidence that, that they do, and the best evidence is through a technique called it's called fluorescence kinetics. And what you do is you dose a plant, a healthy leaf, with a high amount of light very quickly, and then you look for the fluorescence response, which you can't detect with the human eye, but an instrument can. And you look for the maximum fluorescence and the change in fluorescence. And that ratio determines really the relative photosynthetic efficiency of the leaf, or the quantum efficiency. And so what we look at here, and this is research I did with some colleagues at Harvard Forest, is that we studied the red osier dogwood, which has leaves that are the same state. Some of them are red, some of them are not. And we looked at the kinetics between the red leaves here and the green and the old green leaves, and we found that the reduction in efficiency was much less in the red leaves, and the recovery was more rapid and more complete in the red leaves. So this is evidence that the anthocyanins can reduce the depression of photosynthesis, and that at the end of the leaves that you get higher photosynthetic efficiency and activity in those leaves. So that brings us into the argument about nitrogen resorption. So most of the nitrogen in a tree is in its leaves, and about half of that nitrogen is present in the proteins that are the structures and the function of photosynthesis, and then half of it is in the chlorophyll molecules, which you can see right here. Each molecule has 4 nitrogens, and so that's about 50-50. Now, during the senescence process, as these materials get to be broken down, the chlorophyll molecule produces byproducts that are extremely photoactive and therefore toxic to the plant. So it happens in a relatively efficient way, but still there's a danger during that process that these photoactive compounds can disrupt membranes, they can inactivate proteins and so forth. So plants do this as efficiently as possible, and the breakdown products from the chlorophyll are moved into the vacuole of the cells, the vacuoles of the cells. So they're just, the vacuole is like a trash pit. They stick them in there where they can't do any more harm. On the other hand, the proteins that you see that are so important in the photosynthesis process that hold the chlorophyll molecules, that funnel energy and so forth, those proteins can be broken down. They're not toxic in the intermediate stages, produce amino acids, and they can be resorbed by the plant. So what this means then is that about half of the protein, it varies some, about half of the protein that's broken down from the leaf senescence goes back into the plant in the large stems and the roots stored for the winter, and about half of it as chlorophyll is basically present in the leaves, in the vacuoles, falls off the tree when the leaves senesce. Then it can be absorbed later by plants the following years as nitrogen. So we think then that what's going on is that the photoprotective process helps protect the production of photoactive components of the chlorophyll breakdown and reduces the amount of disruption so that the chloroplast protein is better resorbed into the plant. The evidence we have for that, which is limited, is that if you compare leaves, fallen leaves, you can look for the amount of nitrogen in the leaves, and it varies. The more anthocyanin and photoprotection then means that there'll be less nitrogen in the leaves and more is resorbed into through the protein into the plants. So those are the basic ideas that have been raised about function. I want to mention one other thing, and that is that anthocyanins they're potent antioxidants. So this paper came out, I don't know when it was. Well, it was 1999, so it's a long time ago. When it came out, the blueberry industry took advantage of it. And they got their media people, and they went after retired people like myself. And they said, you know, if you eat more of these berries, you're going to have you'll have more antioxidant function, less free radicals or free oxygen species that could cause disruption and aging. So now you go to a health food store and you don't buy anthocyanins. Well, you probably don't even buy blueberries. You buy C3G in a jar, and you can put that in your whatever in the morning. So the question is, well, could this antioxidant activity of anthocyanins help protect the plant? And the problem is that the anthocyanins are produced in the vacuole of the leaf, so they're not located in a way where that antioxidant activity could actually help the chloroplasts. However, in the senescence and tissue damage as the leaves get old, they produce a lot of hydrogen peroxide, which is also a free radical species. And the anthocyanins will actually inactivate the hydrogen peroxide in the plant. So they probably don't really do very much, but have to mention that. So here's the fruit flag hypothesis here now. Now we're on to the ecological functions. And these are examples. That's euonymus, which has yellow berries, red leaves, and so people argue, well, perhaps the red color is a signal for birds to find the fruits and consume them and disperse the seeds. Another example is the Indian cucumber here in the upper right. It has these black berries, and it always has this flush of red color at the base of the leaves. So people have argued that, again, so that's a aid in dispersal, finding the fruits, and same thing possibly for cherry. The only problem with this great idea, which has been around for quite a while, is that there's no evidence for it. So people have actually empirically tried to see if they actually function as fruit flags, and there's no evidence for it. So that's the research on function. The final one is the one of appearancy. The yellow color or even red color is an advertisement that warns a potential herbivore that either the leaves are toxic or they have no nutritive value and it'd be a waste of time. So the evidence for this the research has primarily been on aphids that attack leaves of many, these are common plants like the beach blight aphid. And there's some evidence for some species that yellow leaves actually have less egg-laying aphids on them than green leaves do. But the hypothesis is not well developed. My personal sense is that going out in the forest, working in the Northeast, that I saw very little aphid activity or even leaf damage in the fall. And also, there's no correlation between the color and toxicity. It's possible that the yellow leaves have less nutritive value because they've lost a lot of their nitrogen. But so those are the two main types of hypotheses as they stand now. So just to conclude this talk, leaves turn yellow as carotenoids are exposed during the breakdown of chlorophyll. This is the idea we always had about autumn color. If you read an old botany textbook, it always says that the pigments that you see in the leaves during the autumn are simply there. They've been there all along. They were masked by the chlorophyll, and as the chlorophyll breaks down, then you see them. And that certainly is the situation for the carotenoids. They are exposed during the breakdown of chlorophyll in the chloroplasts in the leaves, and so the leaves become yellow. However, leaves turn red as anthocyanins are synthesized during the breakdown of chlorophyll and the senescence of the leaf. So that's a much more interesting situation than the carotenoids. And so we believe now that the anthocyanins are physiologically protect leaves, and they allow them to better resorb nitrogens used the following year. Just, I don't know, it was about a month ago, I was looking at my electronic version of the New York Times. And of course, Science Tuesday, they always have these little research bits about this and that. And there was an article, it was an announcement from the U.S. Forest Service, which has some labs in the Northeast, and they do research on many of these trees, saying that the anthocyanins physiologically, they protect the leaves, and they allow them, they basically subscribe to this hypothesis of protection and resorption of nitrogen. So that's the PR now on anthocyanins and its function. I don't know about the carotenoid function as a advertisement against toxicity. I think sometimes people just, when they see color, they see it as something that we can see and animals can see. They assume that color just has to have a function, like flowers attracting pollinators, and fruits attracting dispersers. But it's quite possible that the color that we see is actually just a byproduct of wavelengths of light that are absorbed by the plant and prevented from damaging tissue or changing the physiology within the plant. So then it's not the case of what we see. It's really more a matter of what we don't see that's important. So I'm going to wind this up now with a little bit of a poetic aesthetic ending. I'm going to show you, so it's just a 3-minute little slideshow about autumn colors in general, and then I'm going to read a couple of poems. So now, to end on a poetic note, what's the value of scientifically knowing about the change of colors during the autumn that would affect your appreciation of that experience? And so here's two views of this. On the top we have Walt Whitman. He says about birds and trees and flowers and watercraft, a certain free margin and even vagueness, perhaps ignorance, credulity helps your enjoyment of these things and of the sentiment of feathered, wooded, river, or marine nature generally. I repeat it, don't want to know too exactly or the reasons why. But then Edward Arlington Robinson wrote, the gods are growing old, the stars are singing golden hair, to gray-green leaf, to yellow leaf, or chlorophyll to xanthophyll, to be more scientific. So now if you want to learn more about autumn color, if you write down my email address, I will send you a PDF of an article that's about 3 years old, that's written for a more general audience about autumn color. Or you could buy my book, which is published in 2007, which is now real cheap on Amazon. You can imagine. And there's a chapter in it called Why Leaves Turn Red. Okay. I think we have time for some questions. Yes?
So you sort of alluded to this a little bit, but some species like aspen have much broader spectrum of color, so orange.
That's right. That's,
Cottonwood or just yellow.
you know, if no one had asked the question, I would have asked that myself. So 99% of the time, an aspen turns yellow. The leaves turn yellow. So why is it? And of course, when we see aspens or a small grove of aspens turn red, it really jumps out at us. And so we really look for that. And so the question is, why do you have this variation within that species? And I'm not exactly sure, but when I was working on this stuff, there was a guy, Jim Erdman, who's a retired botanist for the USGS that was living in Crestone, and he'd been watching that, and he pointed out an article that a geologist had written about color, because sometimes you see like a sort of a narrow line of color, or a little bunch of it. And he claimed that there was a correlation between the production of red color in aspen with the subsurface geology. And that if you had rocks that were low in certain essential nutrients or produced too much of certain nutrients, that could stress the plants and they would produce red color. So that's a possibility, or it could even be another kind of, could be a physical stress, drought stress or something like that, that could cause the color. It is, anthocyanins are often produced by plants independent of autumn senescence as response to disease, drought stress, and so on and so forth. So that might be the case for aspen, though. It could be geology. Yes?
What is it that serves as the trigger to signal to the plant that it's time now to begin destroying the chlorophyll along either the synthesis of
Yeah.
anthocyanins
It is timed, and it varies. It's a function of temperature. It's also a function of day length. Actually, the senescence process starts probably in August, early August. So you don't see it, but there's a reduction in the amount of chlorophyll, and there's a reduction in the maximum capacity of photosynthesis well before you see any results. So it's a timed, highly regulated process. And so it does have signals, probably primarily temperature and day length. Now, it's true also in the East. People are really into knowing. They want to know how bright of season it is. They want to know how much money they're going to make. So there's a lot of speculation about what it is that makes the autumn brilliant or not. So if you have a serious drought in the late summer, you have a lot of early leaf fall and you have less color produced. But it is a highly regulated process. I think the day length is important, but it kicks in a lot stronger if you have a series of days where it's cold and bright, very sunny. That's a high stress to the leaves. The cold slows down their physiological processes. The high light kicks in the photobiological activities, and there's a conflict between them, which is the stress. So those bright, sunny, cold and sunny days really enhance it. I would say, however, that we don't know a lot about this stuff because it's not tied to anything like a disease or even a crop or a profit. It's just people do it because they're just curious about it. And maybe it's close to animals. You have pandas. You've got all these charismatic things that people move towards for the love of the organisms, conservation, and so forth. So maybe the only thing we have in plants besides orchids is autumn color. It's like sort of the plant equivalent to a charismatic megafauna. All right, well, thanks for coming.